Hi, sixth grade. We are reading today Mysterious Benedict Society, and you're working on annotation. And here we go. Our goal for the first day is to read page 1 through 20. So let's open up to pencils, erasers, and disqualification. In a city called Stonetown, near a port called Stonetown Harbor, a boy named Rennie Muldoon was preparing to take an important test. It was the second day of the test. The first had been in an office across town. After that one, he was told to come here to the Monk building on 3rd Street and to bring nothing but a single pencil and a single rubber eraser, and to arrive no later than 1 o'clock. If he happened to be late or bring 2 pencils or forget his eraser or in any other way deviate from the instructions, he would not be allowed to take the test, and that would be that. Rennie, who very much wanted to take it, was careful to follow the instructions. Curiously enough, there was only one given. He was not told how to get to the Monk building, for example, and had found it necessary to ask directions to the nearest bus stop, acquire a schedule from a dishonest bus driver who tried to trick him into paying for it, and walk several blocks to catch the 3rd Street bus. Not that any of this was difficult for Rennie Muldoon. Although he was 11 years old, he was quite used to figuring things out for himself. From somewhere across the city, a church bell struck the half hour, 12:30. He still had to wait a while. When he checked the doors of the Monk building at noon, they were locked. So Rennie had bought a sandwich at a deli stand and sat down on the park bench to eat. A tall building in Stonetown's busiest district must surely have offices inside, he thought. Locked doors at noon seemed a little peculiar, but then, what hadn't been peculiar about the whole affair? To begin with, there was an advertisement. A few days before, Rennie had been reading the newspaper over breakfast at the Stonetown orphanage, sharing sections with his tutor, Miss Permiel. As Rennie had already completed all the test books on his own, even those for high school students, the orphanage director has assigned him a special tutor while the other children went to class. Miss Permiel didn't quite know what to do with Rennie either, but she was intelligent and kind, and in their time together they had grown fond of sharing the morning newspaper over breakfast and tea. The newspaper that morning had been filled with the usual headlines, several of them devoted to what was commonly called the emergency. Things had gotten desperately out of control. The headlines reported that school systems, the budget, the pollution, the crime, the weather, while everything, in fact, was a complete mess. And citizens everywhere were clamoring for a dramatic improvement in government. Things must change now, was the slogan plastered all over the billboards all over the city. It was a very old slogan. And although Rennie rarely watched television, he knew that the emergency was the main subject of the news program every day, as it had been for years. So naturally, when Rennie and Miss Permiel first met, they had discussed the emergency at great length. Finding themselves quite in agreement about politics, however, they soon found such conversations boring, and they decided to drop the subject. In general, they talked about the other news stories, those that varied day to day, and afterwards they amused themselves by reading the advertisements. Such was the case on the particular morning when Rennie's life had so suddenly taken a turn. "Do you care for some more honey with your tea?" Miss Permiel had asked, speaking in Tamil, a language that she was teaching him. But before Rennie could answer that, of course, he wanted more honey, the advertisement caught Miss Permiel's eyes, and she exclaimed, "Rennie, look at this. Would you be interested?" Miss Permiel sat across the table from him, but Rennie, who had no trouble reading upside down, quickly scanned the advertisement's bold printed words. "Are you a gifted child looking for special opportunities? How odd, he thought. The question was directly to children and not their parents. Rennie had never known his parents, who died when he was an infant, and it pleased him to read a notice that seemed to take this possibility into account. But still, how odd. How many children read the newspaper, after all? Now, Rennie did, but he had always been alone in this. He had always been considered an oddball. If not for Miss Permeal, he even might have given it up by now, to avoid some of the teasing. I suppose I might be interested, he said to Miss Permeal, if you think I would qualify. Miss Permeal gave him a wiry look. Don't you play games with me, Rennie Muldoon. If you aren't the most talented child I ever known, then I've never known a child at all. There were to be several sessions of the test administered over the weekend, and they made plans for Rennie to attend the very first session. Unfortunately, on Saturday, Miss Permeal's mother fell ill, and Miss Permeal couldn't take him. This was a real disappointment to Rennie, not just because of the delay. He always looked forward to Miss Permeal's company, her laughter, her wry expressions, and the stories she told often in Tamil of her childhood in India. Even the occasional sighs she made when she didn't think he was aware. They were gentle and littling. These signs, and despite their melancholy, Rennie loved to hear them. Miss Permeal sighed when she was feeling sad for him. He knew, sad to see him teased by other children, sad the poor boy had lost his parents, and Rennie wished he hadn't worried her, but he did like knowing that she cared. She was the only one who did, not counting Seymour, the orphanage cat, with whom Rennie spent the day in the reading room, and he only wanted to be petted. Quite apart from the eagerness to take the special test, Rennie just simply missed Miss Permeal. He was hopeful then when Mr. Rutger, the orphanage director, informed him late that evening that Miss Permeal's mother was considerably improved. Rennie was in the reading room again, and the only place in the orphanage where he could be assured of solitude. No one else ever ventured into it, and freedom from persecution. At dinner, an older boy named Vic Morgaroff had tormented Rennie for using the word enjoyable to describe the book he was reading. Vic thought it too fancy of a word to be proper, and soon had gotten the entire table laughing and saying enjoyable in mocking tones, until Rennie had finally excused himself without dessert and retreated here. Yes, she's much better, said Mr. Rutger with a mouthful of cheesecake. He was a thin man with a thin face, and his cheeks positively bulged as he chewed. Miss Permeal just telephoned with the news, and she asked for you. But as you were not to be found in the dining hall, and I was in the middle of dinner, I took a message for you. Thank you, said Rennie with a mixture of relief and disappointment. Cheesecake was his favorite dessert. I'm glad to hear it. Indeed, nothing like health. Absolutely nothing like it. Best thing for anyone, said Mr. Rutger. But here he paused in his chewing with an unpleasant, worried expression upon his face, as if he thought perhaps there had been an insect in his food. And finally he swallowed. He brushed the crumbs from his waistcoat and said, But see here, Rennie, Miss Permeal mentioned a test of some sort. Special opportunity, she said. What's this all about? This isn't about attending an advanced school, is it? Now, they had been through this before. Rennie had repeatedly asked permission to apply elsewhere, but Mr. Rutger had insisted that Rennie's fate would fare better here, with a tutor, than at an advanced school. Here you are comfortable, Mr. Rutger had told him more than once, and more than once he had thought, here I'm alone. But in the end, Mr. Rutger had his way, and Miss Permeal was hired. It had proved a blessing. Rennie would never complain about Miss Permeal. Still, he had often wondered what life might be like at this school where the other students didn't find him so odd. I don't know, sir, Rennie said, and his hopefulness slipping into dejection. He wished Miss Permiel hadn't mentioned the test, though of course she must have felt obliged to. We just wanted to see what it was about. And now Mr. Rucker considered this. Well, no harm in seeing what things are about, I suppose. I should like to know what it's about myself. In fact, why don't you prepare a report for me when you return? Say, 10 pages? No hurry. You can turn it in tomorrow evening. Tomorrow evening? Said Rennie. So does that mean I'm taking the test? I thought I told you, said Mr. Rucker with a frown. Miss Permiel will come for you first thing in the morning. He took out an embroidered handkerchief and blew his nose with great ferocity. And now, Rennie, I believe I'll leave you to your reading. This dusty room is a hardship on my sinuses. Now be a good man and run a feather duster over the shelves before you leave, will you? After hearing the news, Rennie could hardly return to his reading. He flailed about with the feather duster and went straight to the bed, as if doing this so would hasten the morning's arrival. Instead, it lengthened his night, for he was far too eager and anxious to sleep. Special opportunities, he kept thinking over and over again. He would have been thrilled to get a crack at a plain old regular opportunity, much less a special one. Just before dawn, he quickly rose and got ready with the lights off as to not disturb his roommates. They often snarled at him for reading in bed at night, even when he used a tiny penlight under the covers. And he hurried down to the kitchen. Miss Permiel was already waiting for him, and she had been too excited to sleep as well, and had arrived early. The kettle was just beginning to whistle on the stove, and Miss Permiel, with her back to him, was setting out cups and saucers. Good morning, Miss Permiel, he said froggily. He cleared his throat. I was glad to hear your mother's doing better. Thank you, Rennie. Would you? Miss Permiel then took one look at him and said, You're not going to make a good impression dressed like that, I'm afraid. Mustn't wear striped pants with checkered shirt, Rennie. In fact, I believe those must belong to a roommate. They're a size too big. Also, it appears that one of your socks is blue and the other is purple. Rennie looked down at his outfit in surprise. Usually he was the least noticeable of boys. He was of average size, of average pale complexion, his brown hair was average length, and he wore average clothes. This morning, though, he would stand out in a crowd, unless it happened to be the crowd of clowns. He grinned at Miss Permiel and said, I dress this way for luck. Luckily, you won't need luck, said Miss Permiel, taking the kettle from the stove. Now, please go change. And this time, turn on your light. Never mind how your roommates grumble, so that you must have better luck choosing your clothes. When Rennie returned, Miss Permiel told him that she had a long errand to run. Her mother had been prescribed new medicine and a special diet, and Miss Permiel must go shopping for her. So it was agreed that she would take him to the test and pick him up when it was over. After a light breakfast, neither one of them wanted more than toast. Yet, well before anyone else in the orphanage had risen, Miss Permiel drove him across the sleepy city to an office building near Stonetown Bay. A line of children already stood at the door. All of them were accompanied by parents, and all fidgeting nervously. When Miss Permiel moved to get out of the car, Rennie said, I thought you were dropping me off. You don't think I would just leave you here without investigating first, do you? Replied Miss Permiel. The notice didn't even list a telephone number for questions. It's a bit out of the ordinary, don't you think? So Rennie took his place at the end of the line while Miss Permiel went inside the building to speak with someone. It was a long line, and Rennie wondered how many special opportunities were available. Perhaps only a very few. Perhaps they would be given out only if he had reached the door. He was growing anxious at this idea when a friendly man ahead of him had turned. Don't worry, son. You haven't long to wait. All the children are going inside in a few minutes. They made an announcement just before you arrived. Rennie thanked him gratefully, noticing as he did so that a number of parents were casting grumpy looks at the man, apparently disliking the notion of being friendly to competitors. Then the man, embarrassed, turned away from Rennie and said nothing else. Very well, said Miss Permiel as she returned. Everything is set. You may call me on the telephone when you finish the test. Here is the number. If I'm not back by then, simply call a taxi and Mr. Rucker will pay for the fare. You can tell me all about it this afternoon. Thanks so much for everything, Miss Permeal, said Rennie earnestly, taking her hand. Oh, Rennie, you silly child, don't look so grateful, said Miss Permeal. To Rennie's surprise, there were tears on her cheeks. It's nothing at all. Now you give your poor tutor a hug. I imagine my services won't be needed after all this. I haven't passed it yet, Miss Permeal. Oh, stop being silly, she said, after squeezing him tightly. Miss Permeal dabbed her eyes with the handkerchief, walked determinedly to her car, and drove away just as the children were ushered into the building. It was a curious test. The first section was rather what Rennie would have expected. One or two questions regarding the octagons and hexagons, another devoted to the bushel of the kilograms of that, and another required the calculations of how much time had passed between two speeding trains collided. The last question Rennie answered thoughtfully with a frown, noting in the margin that since two trains were approaching each other on an empty stretch of track, it was likely the engineers would recognize the impending disaster and apply their brakes, and thus avoiding the collision altogether. Rennie raced through these questions, and many like them, and then came to the second sections, whose first question was, do you like to watch television? This was certainly not the question that Rennie had expected. It was only a question of preference. Anyway, of course he liked to watch television. Everybody liked to watch television. As he started to mark down the answer, however, Rennie hesitated. Well, did he really? The more he thought about it, the more he realized, he didn't. In fact, he didn't like to watch television at all. Oh, I really am an oddball, he thought, with a feeling of disappointment. Nonetheless, he answered the question truthfully. No. The next question read, do you like to listen to the radio? And again, Rennie realized that he did not, although he was sure everyone else did. With a growing sense of isolation, he answered the question no. The third question, thankfully, was less emotional. It read, what is wrong with this statement? How funny, Rennie thought, and marked down his answer. He felt somewhat cheered. Well, it's not a statement at all, he wrote. It's a question. The next page showed the picture of a chessboard, upon which all the pieces and pawns rested in their starting positions, except for a black pawn, which had advanced 2 spaces. The question read, according to the rules of chess, is this position possible? Rennie studied the board a moment, scratched his head, and wrote down his answer. Yes. After a few more pages, of which Rennie felt confident he had answered correctly, he arrived at the test's final question. Are you brave? Just as he read the words, just reading the words quickened Rennie's heart. Was he brave? Bravery had never been required of him. So how could he tell? Miss Permeal would say he was. She would point out how cheerful he tried to be despite feeling lonely, how patiently he withstood teasing of other children, and how he was always eager for a challenge. But these things only showed that he was good-natured, polite, and very often bored. Did they really show that he was brave? He didn't think so. Finally, he gave up trying and decided to simply wrote, I hope so. He laid down his pencil and looked around. Most of the other children were also finishing the test. At the front of the room, munching rather loudly on an apple, the test administrator was keeping a close eye on them to ensure that she didn't cheat. She was a thin woman in a mustard-colored suit with a yellowish complexion, short-cropped, rusty red hair, and a stiff posture. She reminded Rennie of a giant walking pencil. Pencils! The woman suddenly called out, as if she read his thoughts. The children jumped in their seat. Please lay your pencils down, the woman said. The test is over. But I'm not finished, one child cried. That's not fair. I want more time, cried another. The woman's eyes narrowed. I'm sorry if you haven't finished, but the test is over. Please pass your papers to the front of the room and remain seated while the tests are graded. Don't worry, it won't take long. As the papers were passed forward, Rennie heard the boy behind him snicker and say to his neighbor, "If they couldn't finish that test, they shouldn't have even come." Like that chess question. Who could have missed it? The neighbor, sounding every bit smug, replied, "They were trying to trick us. Pawns can only move one space at a time, so of course that position was not possible. I'll bet some stupid kids didn't know that." "Ha! You're lucky you didn't miss it yourself. Pawns can move two spaces. On their very first move they can. But whether it moved one space or two is besides the point. Don't you know that the white always moves first? The black pawns couldn't have moved at all. It's so simple. That test was for babies." "Are you calling me a baby?" growled the other. "You boys there," snapped the pencil woman. "Stop talking." Rennie was suddenly anxious. Could he possibly answer the question wrong? And what about the other questions? Except for the odd ones about television and bravery, they had seemed easy. But perhaps he was such a strange bird that he misunderstood everything. He shook his head and he tried not to care. If he wanted to prove himself brave after all, he had just better stop worrying. If he must return to his old routine at the orphanage, at least he had Miss Permeal. What did it matter if he was different from other children? Everyone got teased from time to time. He was no different in that respect. Rennie told himself this, but his anxious feeling didn't fade. After all the tests had been turned in, the pencil woman stepped out of the room, leaving the children to bite their nails and watch the clock. Only after a few minutes passed, however, before she returned and announced, "I shall now read the names of the children admitted to the second phase of the test." The children began to murmur. A second phase? The advertisement hadn't mentioned a second phase. The woman continued, "If your name is called, you are to report to the Monk Building on the 3rd Street no later than 1 o'clock, where you will join children from other sessions who pass the test." She went on to lay the rules about pencils, erasers, and disqualification. Then she popped a handful of peanuts into her mouth and chewed ferociously, as if she were starving. Rennie raised his hand. Yes," the woman said, swallowing. "Excuse me, you said to bring only one pencil, but what if your pencil lead breaks? Will there be a pencil sharpener?" Again, the boy behind Rennie snickered, this time muttering, "What makes him think he'll be taking the test? She hasn't even called the names yet." It was true. He should have waited until she'd call the names. He must have seemed very arrogant. Cheeks burning, Rennie ducked his head. The pencil woman answered, "Yes, if a sharpener should become necessary, one will be provided. Children are not to bring their own. Understood?" There was a general nodding of heads. After the woman clapped the peanut grit from her hands, she took out a sheet of paper and continued, "Very well. If there are no other questions, then I shall read the list." The room became very quiet. "Renyard Muldoon," the woman called, and Rennie's heart leaped. There was a grumble of discontent from the seat behind him, but as it soon passed, the room grew quiet again. And all the children waited with bated breath for the other names to be called, and the woman glanced up from her sheet. "That's all," she said matter-of-factly, folding the paper and tucking it away. "The rest of you are to be dismissed." The room erupted in outcries of anger and dismay. "Dismissed?" said the boy behind Rennie. "Dismissed?" As the children filed out the door, some weeping bitterly, some stunned, and some whining in complaint, Rennie approached the woman. For some reason, she was hurrying around the room, checking the window locks. Excuse me, miss. May I please use your telephone? My tutor—" "I'm sorry, Renyard," the woman interrupted, tugging unsuccessfully on a closed window. "I'm afraid there isn't a telephone." "But Miss Permeal—" "Renyard," the woman said with a smile, "I'm sure you can make do without one, can't you? Now, if you excuse me, I must sneak out the back door. These windows appear to be painted shut." "Sneak out? But why?" "I've learned from experience, any moment now, some of these children's parents will come storming in and demanding explanations. Unfortunately, I have none to give them. Therefore, off I go. I'll see you this afternoon. Don't be late." And with that, away she went. It had been a strange business indeed, and Rennie had suspicion that it was grow stranger still. When the distant church bell struck the quarter hour, Rennie finished his sandwich and rose from the park bench. If the doors to the Monk building weren't open by now, he would try to find another way in. At this point, it would hardly surprise him to discover that he must enter the building through a basement window. As he mounted the steps up to the Monk building's broad front plaza, Rennie saw two girls well ahead of him, walking towards the front doors. Other test takers, he guessed. One girl, who seemed to have green hair, though perhaps this was one of the tricks of the light. The sun shone blindingly bright today, was carelessly flagellating her pencil up into the air and catching it again. Not the best idea, Rennie thought. And sure enough, even as he thought it, the girl missed the pencil and watched it fall through the grate at her feet. For a moment, the other girl hesitated, as if she might try to help. Then she checked her watch. It's only a few minutes, and it would be 1 o'clock. Sorry about your pencil. It's a shame, she said. But already her sympathetic expression was fading. Clearly, it had occurred to her with the green hair girl unable to take the test, there would be less competition. With a spreading smile, she hurried across the plaza and through the front doors of the Monk building, which had finally been unlocked. The metal grate covered a storm drain that ran beneath the plaza, and the unfortunate girl was staring through it, down in the darkness, when Rennie reached her. Her appearance was striking, indeed, even startling. She had coal-black skin, her hair so long she could have tied it around her waist, and yes, it was truly green, and an extraordinarily puffy white dress that gave you the impression that she was standing in a cloud. That's rotten luck, Rennie said, to drop your pencil here of all places. The girl looked up at him with hopeful eyes. You don't happen to have an extra one, do you? I'm sorry, I was told to bring... I know, only one pencil. Well, this was my only pencil. A fat lot of good that will do me now down the drain. She stared wistfully through the grate a moment and then looked up at Rennie as if surprised to see him still standing there. Well, what are you waiting for? The test starts at any minute. I'm not going to leave you here without a pencil, Rennie said. I'm surprised your friend did. Friend? Oh, that girl? She's not my friend. We just met at the bottom of the steps. I don't even know her name. For that matter of fact, I don't know yours either. Renyard Muldoon. You can call me Rennie. Oh, okay, Rennie. Nice to meet you. I'm Rhonda Kazenby. So now that we're friends and all that, how do you intend to get my pencil back? We'd better hurry, 1 minute late and we're disqualified. Rennie took out his pencil, a nice yellow tube pencil that he sharpened to a fine point that morning. Actually, he said, let's just share this one. He snapped his pencil in two and he handed her the sharpened end. I'll sharpen my half and we'll both be set. Do you have an eraser? Rhonda Kesenby was staring at her half of the pencil with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. That would have never occurred to me, she said, breaking it like that. Now, what did you say? Oh, yes, I have my eraser. Then let's get going. We only have a minute, Rennie urged. Rhonda held back. Hold on, Rennie. I haven't properly thanked you. You're welcome, he said impatiently. Now let's go. She still rested. No, I really want to thank you. If it weren't for you, I couldn't have taken the test. And do you want to know something? Glancing around to make sure they were all alone. Rhonda whispered, I have the answers. I'm going to make a perfect score. What? How? No time to explain. But if you sit right next to me, you can look over my shoulder. I'll hold up the test a bit to make it easier. Rennie was stunned. How in the world could this girl have gotten her hands on the answers? And now she was offering to help him cheat? He was briefly tempted. He wanted desperately to learn about those special opportunities. But when he imagined returning to tell Miss Permeal of all his successes, hiding the fact that he's cheated, he knew he could never do it. Thank you, he said. I'd rather not. Rhonda Kesenby looked amazed, and Rennie once again felt the weight of loneliness upon him. If it was unpleasant to feel so different from the other children at Stonetown Orphanage, how much worse would it be to be seen as an oddball by a green-haired girl wearing her own personal fog bank? Okay, suit yourself, Rhonda said as the two of them started for the front door. I hope you know what you're in for. Rennie was in too much of a hurry to respond. He had no idea what he was in for, of course, but he certainly wanted to find out. Inside the Monk building, conspicuously posted signs led them down a series of corridors, past a room where a handful of parents waited anxiously. At last into a room crowded with children and desks. Except for an unusual silence, the room was just like any schoolroom, with a chalkboard at the front of a teacher's desk, upon which rested a pencil sharpener, a ruler, and a sign that said, "No talking. If you are caught talking, it will be assumed that you are cheating." Only 2 seats remained empty, one behind the other, to guarantee that he wouldn't be tempted to cheat. Rennie chose the one in front. A clock on the wall struck 1 just as Rhonda Kenneby dropped into the desk behind him. "That was close," she said. "There will be no talking," boomed the pencil woman who had entered just then, slamming the door behind her. She strode briskly to the front of the room, carrying a stack of papers and a jar of pickles. "If any child is caught cheating, then he or she will be executed," the children gasped. "I'm sorry, did I say executed? I mean escorted. Any child caught cheating will be escorted from the building at once. Now then, are you relaxed? It's important to be relaxed when taking an extremely difficult test like this, especially considering how long it is and how very little time you have to complete it." In the back of the room, someone groaned in distress. "You there," shouted the pencil woman, pointing her finger. Every head in the room swiveled to see who groaned. It was the same girl who had abandoned Rhonda Kenneby on the plaza. Under the savage stare of the pencil woman, the girl's face went pastely pale, like an underbelly of a dead fish. "I said no talking," barked the woman. The woman barked. "Do you wish to leave now?" "But I only groaned," the girl protested. The pencil woman frowned. "Do you mean to suggest 'but I only groaned' doesn't count as talking?" The girl, frightened and perplexed, could hardly muster a shake of her head. "Very well. Let this be a warning to you, to all of you. From this moment on, there will be no talking, period. Now, are there any questions?" Rennie raised his hand. "Reynard Muldoon, you have a question?" Rennie held up his broken pencil and made a sharpening motion with his other hand. "Very well. You may use the pencil sharpener on my desk." Rennie hustled forward, sharpened his pencil. He felt all eyes upon him as he ground away. Checking the tip, ground away again, and hurried back to his seat. And as he did so, he noticed Raza Kenneby slipping a piece of paper from her sleeve of her cloud dress, the list of test answers. She was taking quite a risk, Rennie thought, but he had no chance to reflect on it further. As the pencil woman now launched into the rest of her speech, "You shall have 1 hour to complete this test, and you must follow these directions exactly. First, write your name at the top of the test. Second, read all of the questions carefully. Third, choose the correct answers by circling the appropriate letter. Fifth, bring the completed test to me. Sixth, return to your seat and wait until all the tests have been graded, at which time I will announce the names of those who pass." The children were shifting uneasily in their seats. What had happened to the 4th step? The pencil woman had skipped from 3rd to 5th. The children looked at one another, not daring to speak. What if the 4th step was important? Rennie was waiting, hoping someone would raise their hand for a change, but when no one did, he timidly raised his own. "Yes, Reynard?" He pointed to his mouth. "Yes, you may speak. What is the question?" "Excuse me, what about the 4th step?" There is no 4th step," she replied. "Any other questions?" Utterly baffled now, the children held their tongues. "To pass this test," the pencil woman went on, "you must correctly answer every question, by which I mean every question. If you skip one question or answer one incorrectly, you will fail the test." "No problem," whispered Rhonda Kenneby from behind Rennie. The pencil woman's eyes darted from side to side of the room. She stared hard at Rennie, whose mouth went dry. Why on earth didn't Rhonda keep her mouth shut? Was she trying to get them thrown out? "You may begin the test as soon as you receive it," said the pencil woman, turning away at last, and Rennie resisted the urge to sigh with relief. Even a sigh might disqualify him. And that is it for day 1.